Go ahead, Hillary.
Okay, hi everybody. Can you hear me okay? Amanda, thumbs up if you can hear me. Awesome, thank you. Nice to talk to everybody on this Monday evening. My name is Hillary Martin, and I'm a co-owner of Digger's Mirth Collective Farm. We're in Burlington, Vermont. And I, by no means, am an expert on this subject, but we've been now tarping for about 3 seasons. And I guess it was 2019 that we wanted to start tarping. And just before we did that, we attended a conference at the Vermont Veg and Berry Growers Association hosted, and it was immensely helpful for me, like going into our first season, just kind of hearing some tips from other growers who had experience. And so that is what I'd like to talk about today, is just kind of like how we do it. And I'll just start with a little background on our farm. We have about 16 acres that we manage, and of that, we're cultivating about 12, and 2/3 of that is in vegetables at any time. A third of it would be in cover crop, and we are certified organic, and we mostly do wholesale mixed vegetables. A lot, about half of what we wholesale, or over half, is in salad greens. And all of our wholesale accounts are basically within Burlington. And then we sell to a couple farmers markets, and we have a tiny CSA, sort of in the high months of the summer. Yeah, so I'll just kind of move into it. We actually tarp, with the exception of any beds that we're going to put into black plastic for fruiting crops. We tarp all of our beds as part of our bed prep routine. Okay, how do I change slides? Oh my God. Okay, everything's fine. How we prep beds is we will amend our beds. First off, I guess in the spring, we do kind of subsoil all of our beds using actually a root lifter that kind of undercuts all the beds and kind of lifts and fluffs it up. So I didn't include that here on this slide, but we amend all of our beds, and then we run through with a 6-foot disc harrow, which kind of mounds up our beds. And then after that, we run through with a Perfecta field cultivator, which is like a 5-foot width implement, and that just is like flattens out our beds. And at that point, what we'll do is we'll, if it's not going to rain, we'll actually water our empty beds, or just kind of let it receive rain. And ideally, we'll actually let those beds sit for at least a week, if not more, like 2 or 3 weeks. And we let like a full sort of flush of weeds kind of come in. And then we'll lay tarps down, and we leave those tarps down for about 2 or 3 weeks. And then we lift up the tarps and plant directly into it on the day that we remove the tarp. So that's kind of the general gist of what we do and how we use tarps. Tarps definitely have not replaced weed control on our farm. We're still, we use flame weeding, we cultivate with a tough built tractor, and we hand weed. But I will say that tarping has significantly reduced the amount of time that we're on our hands and knees hand weeding. And I will also say that we have definitely noticed an increase in yields and quality of our greens in a consistent way. And we actually had a researcher from UVM doing some trials on our farm, and her evidence substantiated those, kind of casual observations on our part, just that like the number of weeds after tarping was down, and yields were up. So one thing, our soils are, we have like kind of a silty loam. We have beautiful river bottom soil, and they hold moisture actually quite a bit. And when we started tarping, a lot of times we don't always, even like have to water when we're seeding stuff in necessarily, because sometimes it's just like moist enough down there. And so a lot of the times we were like, nah, it's probably wet enough for weeds to germinate under these tarps. But we definitely had a lot of tarps that we laid down in the first couple years that just sort of seemed to do nothing. And we realized that like, we just never should lay a tarp down if it hasn't directly like rained or been irrigated on. So that was like a lesson we did learn a little bit the hard way. And a lot of times the beds just kind of look like this in the picture, a couple weeds coming up, and that's good enough for us to know that like it's time to put the tarps on. And sometimes they'll look like this. And we actually find it's really important, like the more time that we allow for certain weeds, the more effective it is. Actually, purslane is a weed that actually needs light to germinate. So tarping we've found ineffective for purslane and less effective for chickweed, unless you really allow it to have some time to grow before tarping. But those are those same beds once we've lifted the tarps off, and that's what we will seed or transplant into. So we bought these tarps and we were kind of like, geez, what do we do with these enormous pieces of plastic? We kind of like were a little bit, we went into it not knowing exactly how it all was going to work out. But we just, for us, we have a lot of pretty simple system of successions on our farm. So like kind of most weeks we're planting 4 beds of mustard greens and 4 beds of baby spinach, and then like kind of a lot of the times we're planting 4 beds of a mix of other things. So we ended up sort of with a collection of a lot of like 20-foot wide, or it's probably actually wider than that, tarps that would comfortably cover 4 beds. And we kind of kept them very large for a while we figured out what was going to work for our system. And that's what we kind of settled on, was like a lot of 4-bed tarps, and then a handful of 6, and a couple of 8s, and then some other random ones. But the bulk of ours, it's sort of like modular type system. And we felt like the handling was a lot better for us to cut them in half. So our beds are, anywhere from like 160 to 160 to 200 feet long. And so we cut those down to like 80 or 100 feet long. And then when we got smart about it, we were like, let's make sure they're actually all 100 feet long. So we didn't have some tarps that were like too short for some beds. When we're actually laying the tarps down onto the beds, we have them in a pile that I'll sort of explain a little bit later, but we just like grab the end of the tarp that's going to lay down in the middle of the bed and grasp that end and then like kind of run down the bed. So for a 4, generally, if they're pretty dry, a 4-bed tarp can be handled, you know, like a half of a bed of a 4-bed tarp can be handled by 2 people that just go on either side of that tarp and run down the paths. And then we kind of, you know, if it's 6 beds, it's like 3 people. It's nice if we have 4 people for the 8 beds, you know, the very wide tarps. So we will sort of adjust to like how many people are on each tarp, depending on the crew size of the day and what the size tarps that we're moving. And we learned that just the more that we can make sure that there's air between the tarp and the soil, the lighter the tarp will feel because there's just less friction of that tarp dragging. So either like running with the tarp kind of like with your arms kind of up in the air will kind of get that tarp aloft a little bit. And then if it drags, kind of like grabbing an end of it and like really shaking it to get air underneath will help it move. And I always find that like moving tarps is just like a really kind of a fun team building activity that if people are kind of stoked, it just helps everything. So here's sort of a video, and this is, I actually had like a pile of students at the farm the other day. So we did have an abundance of people, but this is just a good example of how it goes. And, so you want to make sure there's like a good amount of overlap where those 2 tarps meet. We like, you know, a good couple of feet is awesome. To hold the tarps down, we did experiment way in the beginning with just using soil to hold the tarps down. That's what we use for our Remay and Protect Net. And it was really, we were super resistant to using sandbags. It just seemed like such a pain. And we found that the soil seams were great to put down, but they were like terrible to remove because the tarps are so heavy that lifting, you know, the edges to dump the soil off of the seams was just terrible. So we quickly learned that sandbags were superior. And really, there's just like no such thing as too many sandbags. And I always remind my coworkers that spending the time to like fill the sandbags, have plenty on hand and put them down on the tarp, even though it takes longer in the moment, is a lot better than fixing a tarp that's blown off and like finding it when you're all by yourself on Sunday afternoon and trying to fix it and like pull it back on over the beds. So it's kind of like one of those stitch in time things, just like as many as possible. Sort of like every 2 or 3 feet, I think is a really good amount. At least for us, you know, when we get that the winds down at the intervale, they'll just whip them off. Another thing that we try to do is like, ultimately, you know, I think we've come around to just like more sandbags is the best method, but we've played around with thinking about like prevailing winds. So if you get wind from a certain direction and you have overlapping tarps, like if the wind comes from the north, have the tarp that's coming from the north go over the other tarp. So you can imagine the wind just kind of like not working against the seam and lifting up. Excuse me. We use extra sandbags at seams where tarps are overlapping tarp. So we always, like in those seams, we put a sandbag in the bed, but then we'll also put a sandbag in the middle of the bed. So again, just anytime there's seams, like using a lot to weigh them down. And we also try to, like, if the tarp is a little wider than the area that you're covering, just try to like remove some of that slack, because anytime that there's slack, then the wind can get in and like whip around and like have its way with the tarp. So just try to eliminate some of that slack. And we find that scrunching up extra tarpage in the pathways, and putting the sandbag on like a scrunched piece of plastic is more effective than like neatly folding it over. Sometimes we've experimented with like folding tarps because it feels maybe like a better way, but that just creates a very slippery surface and things kind of whip out from under the sandbags. It's great actually when it rains, and like the rain sort of holds it down for you. You know, inevitably your tarps will blow off and you'll be like, oh, should I use more sandbags? It's just like it's just sort of part of this. It's like the struggle continues, really. But so just like a couple tips on removing the tarps. You know, we'll go through and just like take all the sandbags off. It's nice to have something in position to receive the sandbags, you know, like a tractor bucket or a truck, so that you're not lifting those bags more than you need to. And we sort of do the opposite. We'll go to the middle of the tarp and pull it back, kind of folding over itself, and then run back towards the end of the field. And especially when they're heavy and they have water in them, doing that like shaking move where you're trying to get air under there is helpful. Of course, more people is helpful as well when there's a lot of puddles and water. Once we get the tarp, once we kind of reach the top of the bed, we just let that tarp fall into like an accordion at the end of the field. And that was the sort of shape I was referring to easily, that that just makes it kind of unfurl easily. It doesn't, you know, if it's not twisted up, it'll like unfurl nicely. And then, you know, when oftentimes we're just like taking those tarps and we're moving them over to the next beds, in which case we'll move each half to the opposite ends of the bed. But if sometimes we're actually taking those tarps and moving them to an entirely different field, in which case we'll make sure all of those tarps end up on one end of the bed, and we'll move them together in one load, instead of kind of having them be far apart and like moving them separately. Here's a little video of that process. Nice job, team. So you can see there's like 2 half tarps there in that accordion shape. And then we take that pickup truck you got a glimpse of, and we just loop around both of those both of those lumps of tarp and drag it to the next field with a strap or a chain. And that was like it wasn't super wet that day, but there definitely was some puddle accumulation. And if you could see, like, they kind of got halfway and then we're just like, ugh, and then they did that shaky thing. And it really does sort of help with that load. And so, yeah, we'll often just sort of like bear hug those accordion shapes and just move them to the next bed over, or we'll grab a strap and like loop it on the back of the truck. And you know, if you kind of roll around and take a lot of turns, I don't know, it can get confusing if you don't leave it in that original accordion shape. But that really saves us a lot of time to make sure that's preserved. And then we just sort of leave it where it's going to go. And oftentimes in our operation, we have somebody that's just like driving tarps around and moving the sandbags while the crew is busy like removing and laying down tarps. Well, this was just for fun. Just it's not infrequent that we do have people like lose their phones and walkie-talkies, so sometimes it's good just to like set them aside because it's hard to find them underneath the big tarp. So a couple things, just like a couple random things I guess that we've learned is, you know, always take the time if you're going to be doing cultivation next to your tarp edges, even when they're sandbagged. Like this is an early picture where, I'm sorry, this was back in 2019. And we were like, oh, it'll be fine. Just like run that tractor next to the edge. But it's like always worth it to just move the tarp in before you run an implement next to it and then move it back. It's just, otherwise you'll end up tearing it or throwing soil on it, and just always take that time. When we store the tarps, for kind of, I guess if we were to leave tarps kind of sitting in the field, or definitely over the winter, we kind of tuck them all in so there are no pockets where water can pool, just for ease of handling in the future. So of course, you know, we do a whole bunch and everybody was like, oh my gosh, they look like joints. So that's kind of our new terminology, is just like roll them up into joints, like keep them tight. And so water sheds off instead of pooling. And yeah, we've just been in a couple spring times where we're like, oh, we don't know like what tarp is what, you know? So we've learned for our half bed tarps to always store them together next to each other. We've started labeling them. We've just got a bunch of flagging tape that rides around in trucks, and we have some in our shed, and we now label our remay as well as our tarps, but we take that big huge kind of tube of tarp and we just wrap the whole thing in some flagging tape that indicates how many beds wide that tarp is, so that, you know, in the spring we know what we're dealing with, and we just kind of let them sit in the field where they're most likely to go in the next spring. And we also tarp our sandbags just because they do photo degrade, so for what it's worth, we just try to keep them going a little bit longer. I think that's the end of my presentation. Just, you know, everybody's tarping, even the bread and puppet theater. Did you see this, Amanda? No, okay. This is the theater company up in Glover, Vermont. And I was like, oh my gosh, they're tarping. That's all. I think I will stop sharing and pass the screen to Amanda.
Anna, do you want Hillary to answer the questions that came up in the chat now, or are we going to do all the questions at the end?
Yeah, I'll probably just do all those questions at the end, and then we can go into discussion after we've done all the question and answers.
Okay. Okay. Can you hear me? Hillary? Thanks. So my name is Amanda Andrews. I farm with my crew 7 acres in Plainfield, Vermont, about an hour southeast of Burlington, outside of Montpelier. Sell locally, wholesale to our co-op in Montpelier and to a regional CSA that's like 150 shares in the Mad River Valley and 150 shares outside of Boston. But the bulk of what I do, what we grow, is wholesale down to New York City through a distributor up here that ships it down to my distributor down there. And then from there it goes to the fancy people in New York. We produce year round, 7 acres in vegetable production. The bulk of that is in fall production. And then I have 8 tunnels that we mostly just do spring and winter production in, and they kind of just chillax in the summer. This picture kind of shows what our farm looks like in the spring. So we try to get our fields worked in late March and get tarps on early, make use of that winter water that Hillary's talking about. The beds cannot articulate that enough that they need to be moist, and have some cover crops coming up on the left and the right of this picture, but you see lots of different ways of covering soil in this picture. So this is the same presentation that I think Hillary was talking about, Vermont Veg and Berry 2019, maybe winter conference. This is a farm up in Canada. I pulled this picture from a slide presentation they did. The picture on the left is a tarped field, and the picture on the right is their traditional tillage practices, you know, just harvesting, tilling, replanting, as opposed to like harvesting, tarping, and then replanting. And it just, when I saw this picture, I was pretty sold on trying out tarping. It is weed management, but there is something else happening in there. It's pretty minimal temperature increase that you get underneath these black silage tarps that we're using. But it's doing something microbially that's doing great things for the crops. And there's researchers, I think, at like every Northeast ag school working on it right now and figuring out what the special sauce of tarping is. Okay, so tarp lesson is that when you're using new tarps, they shrink. So you want to overlap them quite significantly. And like Hillary was saying, lots of sandbags at seams. So you can see kind of pathway sandbags, bed sandbag, pathway sandbag, bed sandbag. And you can see in this picture our irrigation line underneath it. These beds were irrigated before we tarped them. So prepped in May and then fertilized, irrigated, similar to what Hillary is saying, just exactly as if you're ready to plant into them, but instead of planting into them, you put a tarp down. And, you know, I don't irrigate my beds before I plant into them, but I do irrigate them before I tarp them, unless you got a nice, steady, good rain. We farm, all of our fields are hillside fields, so we actually have to be careful about rain can run off because some of our beds, so we try to aim for irrigating and then tarping rather than waiting for rain. And yeah, we leave, if we can, leave our irrigation underneath the tarp, so it's just there to go when we take the tarps off, especially if we're direct seeding something in, one less step to do, but that's, we don't have endless irrigation, so that doesn't always happen. So this field, you can see tarped June 9th. I don't remember. I think we seeded carrots June 23rd, and then here they are, July 23rd. Amazing germination. And you can see that kind of spot at the top where tarps slid apart from each other. That's the weed growth that was suppressed or, you know, killed underneath the tarps. And I think that we never flame weeded these carrots. We basket weeded them a couple times and then did like a quick walkthrough hand weed of big stuff, but and thinning. And yeah, great for crops like carrots that are not weed competitive. And you really want to give them a jump start for germination. Similar to what Hillary was saying about the space next to a tractor, next to a tarp bed, we have learned that if we're tarping a 4-bed chunk, we want to prep 5 beds and kind of have that, be able to slide that tarp over and like plant into that 5th bed, because it's really hard to prep the bed next to your tarps efficiently. So we try to think ahead and prep it as we're prepping our tarping beds. Yep, prep the bed next to tarps beforehand. Otherwise, you just kind of end up with a weedy strip that we end up weed whacking, and it's just another task to do and field space that's lost. Yeah, so you can see in this picture the weed species that are suppressed, and I really liked this picture because you can see there's a lot of grasses that are being, you know, you have broadleaf annuals like our lamb's quarter and your hogweed that are being knocked back, but you also have like dandelion and grass in there that you don't have in the carrot beds, which is really helpful. You know, broadleaf annuals are way easier to manage. Tarping is not a, you know, it's not a silver bullet for grasses and rhizomious plants. And I'm learning more and more, like Hillary was saying with purslane, we've had a problem this year with galansoga and ragweed, kind of the warmer weather weeds of beds that we spring tarped and then planted, like took off and planted into in July. And those hot weather weeds came up in a flush. They weren't, because they hadn't germinated before we tarped them. We didn't get that suppression. So that's something that I actually think about for our tarping rotation moving forward is kind of what your tarping versus planting timing is and what weed suppression, what weed groups you're going to be getting germinating in that time. And someone in the chat asked about winter tarping. And I think Hillary mentioned this also about chickweed, is that I would be really careful with winter tarping. I would get a good flush of chickweed and then put your tarp down rather than trying to tarp in the fall and then, or like tarp in the fall and leave it on over winter. If you don't kind of have the weed species, the conditions for that weed species before you put your tarp on, you're not going to capture it in your tarping kill, is kind of what I'm anecdotally realizing. But we do tarp tunnels. I don't have any pictures of clear tarps, but I have done some clear tarp solarizing. When I've used clear tarp solarizing is if I have a really luscious crop growth like killing wintered over spinach that started to bolt, and you kind of weed whack it or mow it, and you have really thick basil growth. Solarizing that is great for knocking it back, but getting some of that, you can get some of that material in the soil. And using black tarps, if it's just like a completely harvested crop, or we've weed whacked or mowed a dead, desiccated crop. And you can broad fork some of that stuff in, or if you have a tunnel situation where you can use tractors in it, but it seems like most of the people here are not using tractors, and we don't use tractors in our tunnels. So we broad fork in our tunnels. We broad fork some material in, we'll tarp it to irrigate it. We have really great overhead irrigation in our tunnels. Irrigate it to get moisture in there so that the soil can break down that material. Leave the tarp on for about 10 days, then we'll take it off and finish prepping those beds, doing any amending and getting them ready for seeding, and then put the tarp back on to kind of weed suppress. So it's kind of like a managing, and this is how we do buckwheat in our tunnels too. I just didn't have pictures of it, but can kind of knock it back and incorporate it underneath the tarp, and then prep your bed, and then put the tarp back on to kind of get your weed suppression. And we have really stubborn grasses coming in along the side of our tunnels, and the tarping really helps with knocking them back. It kind of doesn't kill them, but they are blanched and come up out of the ground really easily. You have like the main rhizome, but they don't have the energy to put off all their side growth rhizomes, so you can kind of like pull them straight out of the ground, and it's a super satisfying feeling. And so this picture is kind of like an example of the special sauce thing I was talking about. So this is an example of a tunnel that we solarized and then broad forked and put black tarps down to kind of incorporate some of this material. And this is where a black sandbag was over a solar tarp for 48 hours. And you can kind of see that like black plastic capturing moisture and heat on ground, that it's just like immediate biological activity happening and breaking down material, and it's pretty cool. Whatever is doing, whatever the tarps are helping, it's helping in a good way. And so how do we handle our tarps? I'm going to say like totally opposite things of what Hillary said on this front, or maybe not totally opposite. And I think a lot of it has to do that all of our fields have a slight slope to them. So when we have, this is right after application. This is not what our tarps look like after they've been down for 2 weeks. You know, there's going to be mud and rain in all of these pathways. So we kind of walk any moisture down. So I would start up here at the top at this seam and kind of walk moisture down off the field. I try to overlap the edges of my tarps on grass so that all that rain that we're getting on the tarps is running off onto grass rather than onto soil. You want to be careful about having tarp edges on tilled field. You can get like washout real fast. And when you're walking that moisture off, you're going to get like it's like dropping 20 gallons of water in one spot. So we get them as dry as possible. And I have found that 2 people, if there's more than that, people are kind of standing around and jumping in places where it's not necessarily too helpful. So we try to do it with just 2 people that have done it before, a day with not too much wind and not at the height of the day. So for us, that magic time is like between 8 and 10 o'clock in the morning before the sun gets too hot, and then like late afternoon winds pick up, and you want, it's tough enough with like Mother Nature on your side. So and so the way we do it is hot dog and infinite hamburgers. So if you think about like your middle school like piece of paper, like hot dog fold versus hamburger fold. So like if this is my tarp, we hot dog fold it until it is the width of one of our beds so that we can walk along in the pathways and we don't step on our bed surfaces. And then we hamburger fold it the whole length of the bed. So we hamburger fold it in half. And then we just continue to hamburger fold it until we end up with a tarp the size of a pallet. And then we palletize our tarps because we are often moving. We don't have the kind of succession planting that Diggers does. So we're tarping like larger sections at a time and then moving them usually to a different field. And we want to always be moving. You want to be doing your folds and moving towards the edge of the field so that we can pick it up with our tractor bucket. For if you're not tractor, if you don't have like a machine equipment way of picking up the tarps, I would definitely recommend cutting them into smaller pieces so that they're more manageable, and still taking that, folding it off of your field, like how Diggers is like accordioning them to their roadways, and we are folding them like into our pathways, and so that you can not destroy your beautiful bed surface that you just worked so long on prepping. And we went to this folding method this year, and it's been working really great this year, just doing the like hot dog, infinite hamburgers. It makes us really hungry, but we end up with really neat tarps, and we label our tarps. We also have a color coordination system we have 4-bed tarps and 5-bed tarps that either have silver duct tape in the corner for 4 beds or yellow duct tape in the corner if they're 5-bed tarps. And they go in separate pallet bins. And we've gone to the folding because it just, that like surface tension that Hillary was talking about is it's a real deal. And if you're fighting like water, mud on the top and then like surface tension on the soil side, and in our case fighting slopes also, it's just like too many fights. And we went to just a neat fold system, and we're liking it. And then it's also just like they're ready at the end of the winter. We can just like throw, like in this picture you see that's 2 or 3 tarps in that pallet bin, and then there's a black tarp on top waiting to just go over that pallet bin for the winter to keep snow and ice out. And then we put our pallet bins in our greenhouse so that our tarps aren't frozen in the spring, so that we can get them on fields if we're fortunate enough to work them early, or in our tunnels, and as we're trying to kill off any winter crops from our tunnels. I think that is my last picture, and I hope that those arrows are helpful of like first fold, second fold, third, fourth, and then infinitely more. I think it's usually like 6 folds to get them to that pallet size. And then 2 people can pick that up and get it in a pallet bin pretty easily. I mean, we're all super strong babes, and you know, you need to have those arm muscles. But yeah, it has worked for us.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for the great presentations. I'm just going to stop the recording.